जी सर।
Sure. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this National Symposium on Retinal Vascular Diseases. Thanks to Dr. Pata for asking me to conduct this symposium. And our chairperson and co-chairperson is here. Chairperson I expect that will be joining us soon. Dr. Natarajan and Dr. Shobhit Chawla have to join us. And the other speakers are in the other sessions, and I expect that they'll be joining us very, very soon. I put together hopefully a very interesting program comprising every aspect of retinal vascular occlusions, and we will start with Dr. Divyansh Mishra. And actually, Dr. Parijat was supposed to be giving the talk, but he excused himself, and Dr. Divyansh was kind enough to agree in the last moment. So Dr. Divyansh, young, like very promising surgeon who works with us, a junior consultant of us. So he's going to talk to us on newer ways to image the retinal vasculature. I couldn't think of any other better person to talk about this because he is in the latest thick of technology. Dr. Divyansh, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mahesh sir, thank you, AIOS, and it's been an honor to be a part of this symposium where all the mentors and the stalwarts of retina are. So I share my screen. So hope my screen is visible and I'm audible. I start my presentation. So
Yes.
thanks again. So the topic which is given to me is very close to my heart. The newer ways to image the retinal vasculature using wide field OCTA, and what is the relevance, utility, and what are the future implications of that. No financial disclosures. So just a small brief. OCTA, it utilizes the OCT derived technique, which gives us in high resolution angiographic images, and how that is provided is by repeated B scans to detect motion contrast from the flowing erythrocytes, either by phase based, amplitude based, or a combination or a complex amplitude based. So what is the present relevance to come about, which is more important for us, and utility of it? To identify CNVMs in cases which is not very obvious, like in Best disease, in PFTs, and yes, the quiescent CNVM, which does not show us any structural changes like intraretinal fluid. OCTs are also helpful in understanding vascular diseases like diabetic retinopathy, vein occlusions for FARs, non-perfusion areas or IRMAs, and yes, very well structurally delineated new blood vessels, as we can see, which does not show any leakages. It helps us diagnosis and management of PCV or BVNs, which are very well seen. In treatment responses of CNVMs in specific cases like pseudoxanthoma elasticum, in cases of RP, we can see the reduced vessel density, enlarged FAZ, and disruption of foveal arcade. Most importantly, in the deeper vascular network, it can also be utilized in vascular tumors, as we can see that after laser, the vascularity of the tumor decreases. And yes, it can also be utilized in cases where the tumor is a pigmented tumor, where the vascularity is not seen, but the OCTA clearly shows us that after treatment, decrease in vascularity. It can come to help us to rescue patients which have a transformation of melanocytoma, but in this case, as we can see, that there is no vascularity, and that was proven even on biopsy of this case. It can help us diagnose choroidal hemangiomas, where the choroidal slab shows us a bag of worm-like appearance, line of demarcation between normal and abnormal, and the deeper choroidal layers can show us club-like appearances. It can also help us unearth unobvious choroidal hemangiomas, where the B scan can show thickened choroid as compared to normal, and again demarcation from normal to abnormal and fine thread-like structures, which can be seen. And yes, the new kid in the town, ERNVM, is very well identified in the VRI slab or a vitreoretinal interface slab, where we can see the new blood vessels very well, as we can see in this case. Wide field octa. So how does a wide field octa can be taken? So there are multiple ways using magnifying lenses like EFI technique or an innovation wide field technique, where we can use a 90 diopter lens or a montage or a single shot 12 by 12 or 9 by 15 by 9 mm. In an EFI technique, we can take a larger field of view with more than 30 degrees of FFA, as we can see in this case, which the author had shown. It can also take a wider 16 mm with a 12 mm scan ratio, what we can see utilizing a 20 diopter lens. There are some newer advances which a 20 diopter prototype lens has been designed by Zeiss, which is not yet in market, which gives us a better quality. And as the study which we had published, we can take a widest field of view using a 90 diopter lens at 20 mm Yes, but everything comes with flaws. If the velocity of flow is lesser, that overestimates the CNP areas, and EFI overestimates the peripheral non-perfusion areas because of the edge effect, and it can have lower resolution. Other effects, like it actually underestimates the neovascularization, one by not depicting the dye leakages, and low flow velocities are not detected if the neovascularization does not have the flow, and the segmentation errors can be there. So the advantage of EFI is single fast acquisition, lesser time, free motion artifacts. But yes, the disadvantage is lower resolution, additional areas of the periphery which are covered gives overestimation, learning curve. Montage technique, as this study shows us that we can take a montage of wider field. What is an implication? So superficial capillary plexus, as we can see, shows us is normal to the border of the fovea, and beyond that, it becomes scarer till the periphery. And the intermediate capillary plexus is normal till the edge of the fovea, and beyond that, it's completely absent. The deeper capillary plexus is near to normal. The intermediate capillary plexus is not detectable beyond 8 mm. And theoretically, why? Because the retina is thinner at that point. So the ultra wide field OCTA can also be taken using again montage technique and 100-degree field of view, which we can binarize and then annotate the choroidal non-perfusion areas in that, on non-perfusion area. And as we can see in these cases, that a follow-up can also be done, whether the regression is happening for the neovascularization, whether the non-response is occurring. In this patient, the author has suggested that FFA was not possible because of the contraindication, but the wide field octa helped us treating in these cases. Whether actually wide field octa has any importance, does that give us any imaging biomarkers? So in this, as we can see, the image vessel density in the deeper capillary plexus is affected more specifically in the temporal, and same for the perfusion density, which is affected in the temporal and deeper capillary plexus. Again, the flaws are there like segmentation, and if we zoom the image, the blurriness occurs. There can be other flaws like artifacts. The advantages in montage is extended field of view, provides valuable clinical information, higher level of capillary network, and important to image beyond 50-degree. But the disadvantage is that longer acquisition time, difficult in patients with poor fixation. Clinical utility of vessel density is still not evaluated. Hard to export the field of research into clinical settings. Whether single shot can be helpful, it looks good. 12, 3 by 3, 6 by 6, 12 by 12. But this study shows us that 3 by 3 is good enough to show that the performance is predictable in cases of diabetic retinopathy. And yes, the wider scans have lower resolution, and the image size gives us a larger proportion of the larger blood vessels, and larger scans have peripheral artifacts, multiple artifacts which has been known. Motion artifacts are the worst to been seen. And yes, the artifacts are more if the pupil is not dilated enough, and if the adjustment or the head position is not correctly aligned. Whether 12 by 12 is selective, yes, it gives us a better understanding of the wider field of view, as we can see, for identification. Whether arteries are more affected or veins, it is more towards the arteries to start with, then the veins take over, and then actually the larger area of the venular non-perfusion is much common. The neovascularization, are there different types? Yes, the type 1 neovascularization, which is like a tree type, which comes a single twig out of the ILM and then spreads over the posterior vitreous cortex, as you can see in this, the author is described. The other ones are more difficult ones, which are like giant octopus, which has multiple ingrowths into the retina, and then it comes into the ILM. And the type 3 is much more worse, where we can see it is like a sea fan, where it has multiple ingrowths into the ILM and then comes into the posterior vitreous cortex, as we can see over here, shown by the author. What are the future implications? OCTA, newer algorithms which can help, like projection suppression. As we can see, this image is showing us projection of the blood vessel which is happening into the deeper layer. If that kind of artifact can be suppressed, we can see much better vessels. And the newer town, the 3-dimensional OCTA, which is very important. As we can see, there are different areas of the type 3 neovascularization which can be identified in the newer the 3D visualization, where it can have like small tufts or secules, which has even deeper penetration also, which shows that it can be effective in cases of nascent MNV, which shows that if it passes on to the comes till the RP, then it can show newer intraretinal fluids. It is also helpful in cases of vascular diseases, where we can see the saccular and vascular dilatation, which involves the inner layer and OPL layers. And it can also be studied in 3-dimensional normal and abnormal cases. The take-home message from this talk is OCTA is helpful in diagnosis and management of choriocapillary and retinal pathologies. Wider OCTA can be done using montage or single shot. Advantages of advances in octas are better segmentation softwares, better technology, and 3-dimensional OCTA. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Divyansh, for a wonderful lecture. A lot of new information. Are there any questions or any comments to Dr. Divyansh's lecture? Anybody would like to add anything more?
No, I just thought I'll just ask one or two questions. One is nice presentation, sir. Now, as far as the macular octa is concerned in venous occlusions, does the presence of significant fluid create a problem as far as interpretation is concerned? And, what's the significance of macular ischemia in octa in venous occlusions, in vascular occlusions?
Understood, sir. Understood, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you. I'm far more junior to you, sir. So please don't address me as sir.
Oh, that is a habit, sir.
I can understand. Sure, sir. So yes, so the segmentation errors are always there. So in cases if there are intraretinal fluid, yes, the segmentation causes an overestimation of increased FAZ. Yes, in such cases it's really difficult. But if the fluid is not there, then only we would be able to clearly define the non-perfusion or either increased FAZ. Yes, that's the fallacy of an octa. Yes, sir.
How often would you use the octa in your clinical practice, Dr. Divyansh? Do you use it in all the patients with vein occlusions, or would you use it in selective patients?
So as all of us would have seen the machine, so our machine takes a lot time. So I yes, I do the octa, but I take time once my patients are on a means the end patients where I have adequate time to invest to change or either manually change the segmentation and identify different depths of octas. Yes, I advise the scan, but to review the scan, I would in a busy practice I would try to do a structural OCT, take a decision. But yes, if it's an important case, I would do the segmentation and understand the segmentation and understand the disease with the OCTA in my end of the clinic where the patients are less, because it takes time. It takes time.
Thank you, Dr. Divyansh. If there are any other comments or questions?
One of the most, wonderful talks on octa I've ever heard, actually. So congratulations to you, Divyansh.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Believe me, I do not do too much of octa, primarily because it is time consuming. I do, because the more you sit on the machine, the more you learn on octa. But time spending is very, very important. But in select patients, something like myopic CNVMs or response to treatment, or where, initial FA has been done, or where I don't want to do an FA, so I will monitor these patients on octa. That does help.
Yeah, thank you, Divyansh. We will go on to our next presentation by Dr. Rajiv. This will also be on imaging. Rajiv doesn't need any introduction. Dr. Rajiv is once again a pioneer in many things in India, particularly as far as diabetic retinopathy is concerned. So he's going to talk to us on a little different aspect of retinal vascular imaging as a guide to systemic disease. Dr. Rajiv, please go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Thanks, AIOS, for having me in this very good symposium, very well planned. And next couple of minutes, I'll be sharing with you some thoughts on retinal vascular imaging as a guide to understand the systemic disease in a patient. So it has been used in three conditions. One is a cerebrovascular disease, which comprise of stroke and vascular diseases of brain, cardiovascular disease, including the ischemic events to heart, and to some extent, recently more thing is done on Alzheimer's and dementia. And very rightly, it has been said that eye is a window to the body. So let's first look into cerebrovascular and cardiovascular events. So there are a lot of early life cardiovascular events which are there, like raised BMI, less physical activity. All these leads to programming of the tissues, epigenetic phenomena happen, metabolic physiological change happen, and they all manifest in the adult life as atherosclerosis, hypertension, diabetes, dyslipidemia. And these are the cardiovascular diseases. So this is the one window. When patient has these diseases, we can probably predict some amount of risk of a cardiovascular accident occurring in the later stage of the life. Another window I would say is when in the early life, we have a lot of cardiovascular event, like again, small birth weight, environmental factors. All these later on are reflected in retinal imaging. I would say more as an advanced retinal imaging, where people have used machine learning and image processing to look at these changes. And then they come with an adult, and the adulthood, they have a risk of cardiovascular disease. This is the second window. So by two ways, we can try to look at the risk of cerebrovascular and cardiovascular disease. Now, coming to the cardiovascular, cerebrovascular risk, hypertensive retinopathy is a very important factor. So person having hypertensive retinopathy, once the blood pressure exceeds the autoregulation upper limit, you get focal arteriolar narrowing. And if it's a chronic hypertension, we get a AV nicking or a generalized narrowing. The risk of stroke, both incidence and prevalence, is high in people who have hypertensive retinopathy. But if a person has hypertensive retinopathy plus MRI changes like white matter lesion or infarcts, definitely they have a much higher risk. So hypertensive retinopathy increases the risk of cerebrovascular accidents. However, presence of MRI lesions, definitely there is much more risk of CVA. Diabetic retinopathy, again, there are a lot of studies which have shown it is correlated with the incident stroke, both in type 1 and type 2 diabetes. And atrial fibrillation is also a very important risk factor. And it's like if a person has both atrial fibrillation and diabetic retinopathy, there is a much more higher risk of CVA as compared to those who have only diabetic retinopathy. Regarding retinal vascular occlusions, this was a very good study which had a long-term follow-up, and these are the Kaplan-Meier curves, which show that both artery occlusion and vein occlusion. So the stroke-free rate very abruptly reduces in retinal artery occlusion, means they have a risk of stroke right from the day they present to us with a central retinal artery occlusion. Whereas in RVO, it gradually, the stroke-free rate reduces. That means at 60 days, the hazard ratio for stroke is nearly 9 times for a case of retinal artery occlusion, and it is 2 times for a retinal vein occlusion. Both of them have a risk of stroke. And that's the reason in 2011, American Heart Association and American Stroke Association, they recommended that if a patient has retinal ischemia, they should get a thorough evaluation by a physician. Other retinal condition, which again, phenotype is a lipemia retinalis, which is caused by high triglycerides. And they are more prone for cardiovascular accidents and acute myocardial infarction. They also tend to have more chance of retinal vascular diseases, both artery and vein occlusion. Extensive heart exudate, again associated with dyslipidemia, increases the risk of cardiovascular disease. And extensive heart exudate should prompt for a physician evaluation. These were the retinal phenotypes when we see we should look for or think about cardiovascular or cerebrovascular event. There are some advanced retinal imaging which also gives us some idea about the risk, and Dr. Tin Wong has done a lot of work looking at these retinal vascular parameters, the caliber of artery and the venules, the tortuosity, the fractal dimension, meaning the complexity of the branching, and the branching angle. So these are the 4 things people have looked, and there are a lot of studies which have been published. But in general, it is the venular caliber which is more predictive of stroke. And it's not only stroke, but also for coronary artery disease. But coronary heart disease, it is more a risk factor in women. And increasing arteriolar tortuosity is usually associated with increasing age and systolic blood pressure. And venular tortuosity is more related to a BMI and type 2 diabetes. So that's something, this is the gist of whatever studies have been published till now. People have also tried using deep learning. This is the work by Google team who tried predicting cardiovascular risk factors. So there are various scoring which gives us a risk on what is the chance in next 5 years or 10 years having a cardiovascular event. And with their algorithm, they could predict with a AUC of 0.7, 5-year risk of a cardiovascular event. Basically, the using retinal image, if you look at, it can predict the age, especially the vascular diameters. And more interestingly, which really we don't know, it was predicting a gender looking at the fovea. So if you see the heat map, it was looking at fovea to tell whether it was a man or woman. There are newer imaging techniques also which people have used for risk prediction. the AO imaging, where they are trying to look at the wall to lumen ratio, which is correlated with hypertension. And more recently, people also looking at OCTA, superficial retinal capillary density, associated with a risk for coronary event. Regarding neurodegenerative disease, one of the thing which we have not, even before the advent of OCT, was peripheral hard drusen. And those who had these peripheral hard drusen, they had more chances over a period of 2 years to develop Alzheimer's. But now there are more consistent retinal features, mainly related to RNFL. And those who have Alzheimer's, like individuals with Alzheimer's, they show reduction in the inner retinal layers. And if there is a progressive RNFL thinning, there is a higher risk for a lower cognitive function over a period of 3 years. So these things are important, but what is the possible clinical translational path? Definitely on retinal evaluation, if you have these diseases, there is an emergency track, you should refer to a physician. There is emerging role of these quantitative and qualitative methods which have been there, which can probably have more risk stratification. And this may help in early intervention to reduce the risk of cardiovascular, cerebrovascular diseases. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rajiv. Once again, a wonderful lecture giving us a lot of new insights into looking at the eye and finding out about systemic disease. Are there any comments or questions from any of the panel? Our chairperson has joined. Dr. Natarajan is there. Dr. Ajit. Like the vein occlusions, you said about two times the risk of cardiovascular disease. So, yeah. Is there anything you do differently now as far as imaging is concerned, or are you assessing the fundus photographs with AI or anything like that? Or
no, we are not doing that. We did some work on looking at fractal analysis with using one of Dr. Yogeshan's software, but it's not used in clinical. It's more for a research tool. But yes, RVO patients, we do tell them to get, because they have systemic association. While counseling, I always tell that they are lucky that they had the event in the eye. A similar event can happen elsewhere too. I think that's the take-home message. Any of the vascular event, definitely ask them to go to a physician.
Yeah, but like I think probably we'll have a little bit more discussion on that subsequently, because you investigate quite extensively, despite which you will not come to any useful conclusion. That's another caveat which is there. Thank you once again, Dr. Rajiv. We'll go to the next lecture by Professor Atul Kumar. He'll be speaking to us on retinal arterial occlusions. Like Dr. Rajiv mentioned, arterial occlusion in the eye indicates the patient is at a higher risk for systemic problems like a CVA or a heart attack. And so let's look at the retinal artery occlusions and how we go about investigating them and what treatment to be done. Professor Atul Kumar, please.
Thanks, Mahesh. Actually, just a small word on what Rajiv spoke. Can we find out the risk stratification, based on the retinal caliber of the retinal vessels, that this patient is at risk of a cardiovascular accident or a cardiovascular event which may occur? So can be based on the caliber of the retinal vessels. I think some work is going on that the retinal vessels are actually the window to all the vessels of the body, and so we can actually measure the caliber, and especially with adaptive optics and all that, you can find out that which patients are at risk to stroke or MI, and they get aggressive treatment, something like that.
Yeah, Rajiv did mention that. Dr. Rajiv, are you there?
Okay, anyway.
I'll probably come back to him, yes.
So central retinal artery occlusion is a well-known since age-old disease. So it can be a partial or complete obstruction of the central retinal artery, and after it branches off from the ophthalmic artery. Ophthalmic artery is a branch of the fifth nerve. And CRO is it's a basic ophthalmic emergency and analogous to an acute stroke of the eye. It's like having a stroke of the eye. The estimation is it's a low frequency or incidence is low, 1 in 100,000 population, and we generally get to see it rarely. Probably other centers may be seeing more or less, but they probably may have the similar kind of a picture that not so common. There may be a bilateral occurrence, but that's again very rare, 1 and 2%. So in the inner 6 layers of the optic nerve are there you have the central retinal artery, and the outer 4 layers of the retina are supplied with the choroid artery. So the inner 6 layers of the retina are supplied with the central retinal artery. So you have to understand that the papillomacular bundle, there may be a central retinal artery which is there in 6 to 49% of cases, which may be absent in other cases. So knowing this, then we go to the risk factors for CRAO, and also the risk factors are common to many other diseases of the retinal vascular diseases, and cigarette smoking, high homocysteine levels, hypertension, lipid levels, diabetes, cardiac disease, including atrial fibrillation with throw-up emboli, myxomas, and carotid artery atherosclerotic, where you throw up these Hollenhaus plaques, and the carotid vessels throw up these plaques, that can lead to CRAO. Homocysteine, I told you, the factor V mutation, protein CS deficiency, collagen vascular disorders, trauma, and retrobulbar hemorrhage are raised ICT post surgery. So sometimes you put a super pinky and you might end up for very long, you might end up with a CRA block. Or even during vitreous surgery, if you keep the pressure at CRA at 60 for a very, very long time, you might get a pale disc. That's not a classical CRAO, but it's something akin to that. CRAO is basically non-arthritic, usually in our country. It's in the West or UK. We get more of the arthritic form with throbbing headache around the temporal side of the head, and the ESR is massively raised, CRP raised. Non-arthritic form is more common in our country, and the clinical features can be a sudden monolocular visual loss. The patient comes running to the hospital or the emergency or to his doctor, the ophthalmologist, and you can see a pale retina, and the pale retina is actually deep white with cherry red spot. And why we get the cherry red spot is, I'll just tell you, optic nerve edema is also seen in the boxcar segmentation. So the cherry red spot is basically there in many other disorders like the central retinal artery occlusion, the metabolic storage disorders, which includes Tay-Sachs, Sandoff's, Niemann-Pick's, GM1 gangliosidosis, sialidosis, and drug toxicity, quinine, dapsone, carbon monoxide, and methanol. So most of the layers in the center are absent, excepting for the innermost layers of the retina, and so therefore you get this cherry red spot, and you have to know that it's basically the absence of the rest. So you can have a classical cherry red spot where you get Hollenhaus plaques at the bifurcation, but you can get a sparing of the fovea and the central retina, the macula, because of the presence of cerebroretinal artery. So the whole retina is pale, but except for the macula where there's a perfusion, the patient may have some good central vision, but overall vision may be poor because the overall field may be very poor. And fluorescein angiography shows you typically vascular dropout areas because there's no arterial flow in those areas, and the OCT is thrown into folds because of severe intracellular edema. You might get a central scrotoma in the region of the macula, and peripheral constriction of the fields because of the loss of function of the retina. ERG may show totally flat ERG because of the B wave is badly attenuated. B wave comes from the bipolar cells. A wave is from the A wave is from the photoreceptors, but the B wave is from the inner retina. So the inner retina gets affected. The outer retina is supplied to the choroidal vessels. The factors determining visual acuity in CRAO is the duration of the ischemia and type of CRAO, cause of CRAO, site of occlusion, residual retinal circulation area supplied by patent ciliary retinal artery. So duration is so if it's duration of retinal ischemia within 97 minutes, they've shown that there's no retinal damage. So usually the first 1.5 hours is very critical, and beyond that, I would say is about 3 to 4 hours, it's irreversible retinal damage. It's an ophthalmic emergency. We need to do paracentesis, do some digital massage, make the patient blow air into a brown bag so that he gets in carbogen like mixture, which dilates his vessels. And AC paracentesis is something which really helps sometimes if it's a embolic CRAO. And the site of occlusion also makes a difference. More distal it is, the better it is. It may dislodge. And if there's a ciliary retinal artery, it's a boon because it helps in the macular circulation. Acute management it's an emergency. Evaluate the source, refer to a cardiologist, which all that is part of the workup. Get to refer to the cardiologist. CT scan or MRI for if you suspect aortic carotid dissection. And it's very important that the therapy should be dislodge the emboli, reduce the IOP, vasodilate the vessels, ocular blood supply, decrease the retinal edema, maintain retinal oxygen. So ocular massage, you can do it just with the finger or with a Borneo 3-mirror lens or a sublingual isosorbide, sorbitrate, acetazolamide, IV mannitol, AC paracentesis, carbogen inhalation, 95% oxygen, 5% carbon dioxide, hyperbaric oxygen to maintain oxygen in the oxygenated state. Steroids to be started for arthritic CRAO only. So this is the initial management. In patients older than 50, you have to rule out giant cell arteritis, get the C-reactive ESR and the counts with platelets. In less than 50, it's usually to rule out the homocysteine in all levels, because homocysteine is notorious to produce vein occlusions and arterial occlusions. So if there's a vitamin deficiency, B6, B12, then you have to start the patient on supplements. Factor V lead-in deficiency, protein C, protein S deficiencies, antithrombin 3, APLA, sickle cell disease. So all these hypercoagulable lesions which can clotting factor deficiencies have to be taken care of. There have been reports that you can do a ND-YAG laser arteriotomy for extrusion of the embolus and reopening of the central retinal artery. But more that is theoretical. I don't think people may have tried, but may not work too much. May not work too well. The EAGLE study had actually talked about thrombolytics, the TPA, streptokinase, urokinase, and they compared intra-arterial TPA versus a conservative arm. So they tried intra-arterial TPA. So they found no significant difference was found. Study was stopped midway in view of high adverse events. So the EAGLE study showed that TPA had no effect intravenously given intra-arterial. Last slide, I just want to say that you can get a combined central artery and vein occlusion. And now it's not because of embolus or thrombus, basically because of the hydrostatic pressure of the CRVO, which causes a secondary CRA obstruction. The retinal whitening of the cherry red spot along with the venous dilatation, tortuosity with hemorrhages, discs, swelling, and retinal thickening. So you get a lot of hemorrhages like you get in CRVO. The veins are congested, but you'll get a whitening of the retina, and the whitening of the retina suggests that there has been arterial occlusion also. And FA will show a lot of non-provision areas. Macular leakage is minimum. The poor visual prognosis is usually very poor. 80% of them developing neovascularization within leading. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Atul, for the.
Mahesh, can I make some comment?
Sure, sir, sure.
Nothing. I'm sorry, Atul. Wonderful. Nice to see you and really excellent presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Nati.
How are you, Atul?
Fine.
So other than whatever has been described as the treatment options earlier, we are continuing to do the same thing, Professor Atul, or is there anything like would you believe in doing a vitrectomy or embolectomy, anything further, or?
I don't think I would be doing any vitrectomy, and because as it said that by doing vitrectomy you actually decompress the intravitreal cavity and dislodge the clot. But frankly speaking, I haven't tried this procedure. But it's been reported.
Yeah, correct.
Mahesh, Nishikant, you see from Mumbai. Yeah, because like Atul rightly said, 3-4 hours is the window before irreversible damage occurs. But you see, Nishikant has been presenting and he has won a couple of awards for his work on, doing vitrectomy and hyaloid peeling and directly massaging. So, any views on that?
I have done a few patients, but only thing is, I think the time duration as to when you can do. He has done it even after 10 days and
Yeah.
got some reasonably okay results. So I have done about 2 or 3 patients, and the patient did improve, but then sometimes the CRO by itself can also improve. So we could see the embolus going away to the periphery in the couple of patients which we did. But like the visual results have been modest. I have not been getting 6 or anything like that. It's around 660, 636 is what I have got. So it doesn't work in all the patients, and sometimes like you may have to open up that tissue which is at the disc, which can be a little bit scary. But if the tissue is not there and just decompression pushes the embolus outside, that seems to work. Not in all the patients.
But is that because of intervention late, or would you like to do early also? Because if you do it after 10 years, then 10 days when irreversible damage has already occurred, then it may not.
Yeah, but there are 2 ways to look at it. One is like you don't lose anything much unless like the patient develops a retinal detachment. So you can try, but then like earlier we do is better. So what my algorithm is to do a paracentesis and then decrease the IOP, because many times the paracentesis sudden decompression does work quite well, actually works wonders in some patients.
Yeah.
And then about 24 hours it doesn't work, then probably I'll give them the option of doing a vitrectomy and then see if in case we are able to push the embolus to the periphery. If it's a partial occlusion, probably it works. If it's a complete occlusion, then probably pushing the embolus outside also it doesn't work because already the damage has been done.
Yeah.
It is not the embolus. Actually, the lipid deposits within the artery. You can see on examination there is a lipid emboli which are present. If it is a hemorrhagic emboli, then probably that will clot and the fibrosis will happen, which will not get dislodged. And as you rightly said, the initial attempt should be paracentesis. But how many of the patients are coming to us at a very early stage? See, in so many years are over, still we are unable to make the ophthalmologists understand they should refer immediately within 24 hours. Within 24 hours. At least that quick referral is not happening.
I would say
We got one last week.
They should do the paracentesis themselves. They should do the paracentesis themselves, I should say.
Yeah.
That's
No need
true.
of-
Yeah, because we got one last week within, I think 1.5 hours, he reached an PLPR, and by next evening, he was back to 6 actually. It was quite a dramatic and quite exciting situation. And I think if it does work that way, I think we
But
do
you
not
did
really need to
paracentesis,
go ahead with the vitrectomy. Yeah.
Pramod, what did you do? Paracentesis?
No, yeah, a massage followed by paracentesis also.
Okay.
I mean, within 1.5 hours. And
Yeah,
immediately
there
was
is no
some,
harm actually. Give massage, good massage, and then combine with paracentesis.
yeah. So by
What
next day
else you
morning, he
did?
was 6:36, and by evening, it was like a 6:6.
But only by massage and paracentesis.
Massage and then paracentesis. That's what we did. We just wanted to play safe. Now, this type of
Okay.
situation,
So
you are
I always, I don't know whether I'm right. I keep teaching the residents that the paracentesis should be done like in a sudden way so that you reduce the intraocular pressure suddenly.
Correct. It should be done
So that the
abruptly
clot
so
will
that
get
it pushes
discharged.
that. Correct.
That's
I also have one patient who is a photographer living very close by. He came in 2 hours and did what Pramod was saying, same thing. And within 2-3 days, he was back to 6/6.
Very good.
Thank you, Professor Atul Kumar. Thank you everyone for the discussion. We'll go on to the next talk by Dr. Lalit Verma. He'll be speaking to us on branch retinal vein occlusions. Dr. Lalit, please.
Thank you, Dr. Mahesh, and all the chairpersons for having me here. So after these wonderful talks by all the pioneers, we come to the venous blocks. And vascular blocks are second leading cause, we all understand, after diabetic retinopathy. So vascular block can be divided into within the lumen cause, outside the lumen, or inside. So this is a patient who has a vascular block, but it is an inflammatory vascular block. So I'll not be discussing this because here the treatment is primarily steroids, and this patient was put on steroids and had a wonderful recovery with very good visual recovery also. So what we will be discussing primarily is the non-inflammatory BRVOs. And we should understand that there can be many causes. If the hemorrhage is directly sitting on the macula, or if there is a macular edema documented on OCT, or there is an intense macular ischemia. So these are the 3-4 causes of loss of vision in BRVO, and macular edema is predominant thing which we can actually intervene. And that, so till 2009, standard of care was what was told to us by the BRVO, CRVO study groups. And this was nearly more than 3.5 decades back. And till this time, remember, OCT was not there and pharmacotherapy was not available. So it was a long time back, as I said, 3.5 decades back, BRVO study group with these aims in mind, they studied and concluded that grid laser photocoagulation was recommended for macular edema with vision of 6/12 or worse. But they also said wait for 3 months before considering this. So till this time, we were all very happy, and a lot of us during those days used to do some laser, grid laser, and macular laser only if vision is reduced, or sector laser if there is a documented NVE, or if non-perfused areas were more than 5 diameters. So this was the year which saw a leap jump actually. So 3 separate trials changed the status quo, and pharmacological treatment came into vogue. And there were a couple of them which I would like to highlight. One is SCORE study, Geneva study, and this Lucentis studies. The SCORE study in BRVO confirmed the superior efficacy of laser over triamcinolone. Geneva trial primarily on dexamethasone for both BRVO and CRVO. If you see the overall graphs, this is on the top, but if you do a subgroup analysis, then BRVO, the results are much better. CRVO, initially there is improvement, otherwise they tend to come down over a couple of months. And immediately afterwards came this Bravo and Cruz studies. Bravo was on BRVO, and it showed the positive impact of ranibizumab. And this is the graph borrowed from the Bravo study long time back. You show the treatment effect is the tune of around 10 to 11 letters. So this in summary is the 6 months data. If you see mean BCVA gain in BRVO is much higher with Lucentis. 3-line gainers are 60% and 3-line losers are 0.7% only. This was compared to sham. So this created a furor. The intravitreal pharmacotherapy is the mainstay of treatment in non-tractional, non-inflammatory BRVO. What to give, when to give, that was still sometimes debatable. So Dex implant was rarely used in BRVO at least. CRVO we do still, but in BRVO very rare because of positive impact of studies with anti-VEGFs, and that became the treatment of choice. Even Avastin, a lot of personal experiences were there, although PRCT was not much, but Avastin also did wonders. IVTA 0.05 ml of triamcinolone, that is equivalent to 1 milligram or 2 milligram, that also works similar to 4 milligram. So honestly speaking, BRVO is a relatively milder disease, is a relatively good vascular disease to have compared to CRVO, which Giri will be talking. So coming to a couple of more studies which have came later. One was a Brighter study and one was the Comrade B study. Brighter was head-to-head comparison of ranibizumab with laser, and Comrade B was primarily ranibizumab with dexamethasone. So this was the graph from Brighter study which showed superior improvement in BCVA with ranibizumab plus minus laser compared to laser alone. And this was the treatment effect which was shown in that graph. And this gain was, both in patients with baseline ischemia and with or without ischemia, gains were by and large similar. Because initial perception was that in patients with ischemia, this may worsen, but this was not corroborated by this study. Also, shorter duration of BRVOs demonstrated higher visual gains. So the question mark was why to wait. And Comrade B was first head-to-head study comparing ranibizumab with dexamethasone. And the graph from this study shows that ranibizumab displayed superior efficacy over 6 months, primarily because the effect of dexamethasone clinically, although they advocated 6 months, but does not last beyond 3 months or so. So based on all this, a lot of guidelines have been proposed by various groups of ophthalmologists, by Asia Pacific, by Royal College, and European Union also. And what does it summarize is that any patient of BRVO, we should work for systemic disease also, like Atul listed for arterial blocks. We should work up for hypertension, any cardiovascular disease, hyperlipidemia, diabetes. Then from ophthalmic point of view, our main job is to assess ischemia. This you can clinically see by either APD or number of corneal spots or number of dark deep hemorrhages or angiography showing CNT areas. And we should identify, although in much less common in BRVO, still uveitis iridis can be there. And monitor for conversion to ischemic variety. So if the vision is say more than 6/12, you see we can have a conservative kind of treatment because a lot of these patients have relatively good natural history of improvement. However, if the vision is less than 6/12, then the tentacles are high, and especially if the macular edema is documented in a patient of 6/12, then we do consider giving first line of treatment as anti-VEGF. And believe me, all of these drugs, Lucentis, Avastin, or even biosimilars work equally well in these patients. Steroids, I'm not in much favor in BRVO. CRVO I do, but in BRVO, not much in favor because of multiple issues. However, if you have macular ischemia, and macular ischemia with or without OCT balloon, if the OCT is balloon, we do give multiple injections, bring down the OCT, and then consider laser in these patients. However, if the OCT is not high, less than say around 300 or so, we can directly do laser photocoagulation in these patients. Rarely you may see anterior segment neovascularization, then you have to do anti-VEGF plus scatter laser photocoagulation in these patients. So the current management is fresh BRVO, assess baseline visual acuity, slit lamp, IOP, FA, and OCT, investigate for various cardiovascular parameters, can definitely wait if the vision is good, 6/12 or 6/9. However, the vision is less due to macular edema, documented on OCT, and OCT not very high, as I said, then you can consider doing laser. And if the macula is ballooned up, then you give multiple injections, and then I personally follow up with laser as a definitive and stabilizing influence on the number of injections actually. Very rarely you get presenting feature as vitreous hemorrhage or TRD, although not very uncommon in these patients. But sometimes you do vitreous surgery, you find out that there's a BRVO, and that is the time vitreous surgery can be done. Couple of examples. This was a patient, spontaneous improvement occurred with no treatment. This was a patient who required multiple injections of Avastin, then we lasered him and he stabilized. This was another patient who had ranibizumab and then lasered, then reasonable stability for long time. Vascular blocks respond very fast. You see within 1 day the resolution may occur. This was one medical person who got an OCT done before I reached the OPD, and you see within 1 day the resolution of this BRVO, infratemporal BRVO occurred. So thus to conclude, in BRVO, pharmacotherapy has redefined the way we manage these patients of BRVO, specifically the non-inflammatory part and inflammatory, as I said, steroids. And we have moved from only laser treatment, which we used to do a couple of decades back, to pharmacological treatment. And the choice between anti-VEGF and Ozurdex, by and large, anti-VEGF is the first line of management in most of these patients. And combo therapy, once the OCT comes down with laser, does help to make the treatment more finite. Thank you very much for your patient listening.
Thank you, Dr. Lalit. So I thought like we can go ahead with the discussion of both together after Dr. Giri talks about CRO, because a lot of common factors are there. So I request Dr. Giri to please go ahead with this talk on CRO and have a discussion.
So thank you. Am I audible? Thank you, Mahesh, Professor Atul, Lalit Verma, Ajit, Nati, and my dear friends. I will be talking on management of central retinal vein occlusion, and I have made this into a case-based presentation. I made it into a case-based presentation, and I will be, after each case, I will try and give some message based on my experience and also based on the available evidence in randomized trials. So as we all know, the terminologies non-ischemic, ischemic, and hemi-retinal vein occlusion. These are the three conditions that I will be focusing on during my talk. In the management of central retinal vein occlusion, anti-VEGF therapy, when, how, and why, laser photocoagulation, when and how, what is the role of intravitreal steroids, and a few points on the management of neovascular glaucoma, although that's sometimes managed by the glaucoma specialist too. This is my first case. This is a 61-year-old female who presented with a defective vision in the right eye. She was a patient with primary open-angle glaucoma, and she was a pseudophakic in the eye that was affected with immature cataract in the other eye. Now, this is a classic picture of a central retinal vein occlusion, a non-ischemic CRVO, where we see the dilatation and toxicity of the retinal veins with blot and flame-shaped hemorrhages. And OCT at that time did not show any evidence of increase in the CMT, so the patient was educated to come for regular follow-up. However, the patient reported within a few days with a drop in visual acuity, so it was counting fingers 3 meters, a suspicious RAPD. IOP was a little bit on the borderline, and she had significant increase in the central macular thickness. And at this moment, the patient received 1 dose of intravitreal ranibizumab, and within a month, there was a complete resolution of the edema. So in patients with retinal vein occlusion, at least in my practice, I do not do a loading dose regimen or a regimen based on the old CRUISE trial, where in the initial 6 months, patient received their 6 monthly injections, but I treat them on a PRN basis right from the beginning, but try to keep them under regular follow-up. So patient had a recurrence after 3 months, for which again, she received a single dose of ranibizumab. The use of ranibizumab is based on multiple RCT trials. Why I highlighted this case is the importance of understanding the existence of primary open-angle glaucoma, of another risk factor for central retinal vein occlusion. And it's very important for us to examine the fellow eye to look for any evidence of undetected glaucoma. This is very important because many years ago, we had presented a paper in the All India Ophthalmological Society where we reported a significant incidence of undetected primary POAG, especially normal tension glaucoma in patients with central retinal vein occlusion. This is my second case. This is again a female patient, 64 years, blind in one eye due to central retinal vein occlusion, neovascular glaucoma, defective vision in the other eye, already treated elsewhere with the intravitreal dexamethasone implant, and also has received laser photocoagulation. This was the picture when she first came to us, and she had significant increase in the central macular thickness. Patient was treated with ranibizumab initially because patient, after the dose of the Ozurdex, 2 doses of Ozurdex elsewhere, had increase in intraocular pressure, and she was a little concerned about that particular complication. So she was treated on a PRN basis, but you can see here, patient requires very frequent injections, about once in 6 weeks at least. At this moment of time, the patient I shifted to a treat and extend regimen because of the frequent need of intravitreal, ranibizumab. And this is very important because if frequent increase in the retinal thickness slowly results in damage to the outer layers of the retina and affects the final visual outcome. So with a treat and extend regimen, I could stretch her maximum to about 8 weeks. and she is still under my follow-up. And recently I shifted the patient to aflibercept, which gives a little longer duration of quiescence as far as this particular patient is concerned. Therefore, what are the options in eyes that require frequent interventions? One is either we switch to another anti-VEGF, look for intravitreal dexamethasone, and also do a fundus fluorescein angiography. And if there is peripheral retinal ischemia, probably laser photocoagulation also will help. This is my third case. This is a patient, 64-year-old female, who presented with bilateral central retinal vein occlusion, again having diabetes and hypertension. And we should always remember that diabetes, hypertension, obesity, all of them put together, or any one of these disease, along with dyslipidemia, are important risk factors, and we need to look into these factors when we treat these patients. So for this patient, again, had received a dexamethasone implant elsewhere, and this is the picture when she first came and saw me. Her visual acuity in the right eye was reasonably good because of the normal CMT. The other eye had a significant increase in central macular thickness. This patient I treated with multiple doses of DEXA implant in both the eyes. And the reason why I did that is basically when you have bilateral disease, management is difficult. At least the patient gets a longer period of quiescence as far as the disease is concerned. But in spite of 2 or 3 injections of dexamethasone implant, she continued to have recurrence at shorter intervals, about 2.5 to 3 months. At this moment of time, I switched her. I did a fundus fluorescein angiography. There was no evidence of any peripheral ischemia and wide-angle fluorescein angiogram. I shifted her to ranibizumab, but that was a poor responder. And subsequently, she was on bevacizumab, which gave about 6 to 8 weeks of quiescence. And she continued to have bevacizumab in both the eyes. And most important message I want to give is that in these sort of patients, treat these patients only if you find visual acuity improvement, because if the visual acuity is not improving because of ischemia or because of the significant damage to the outer retinal layers, I don't think really there's any purpose in again and again giving intravitreal injections. So she was treated on a bevacizumab in both the eyes, and subsequently she had a phaco, IOL, and Ozurdex. Therefore, at the final visit, just before the lockdown last year, that was the last visit, she came like this. She was going to Canada, and therefore I put her on a bilateral DEXA implant. I've not seen her since then. Therefore, bilateral CRVO becomes a challenge as far as the management is concerned. What is the role of intravitreal steroids? In my practice, I give intravitreal steroids as a primary treatment and treatment name in certain specific situations where patients have had strokes, multiple cardiac events, etc., where probably there's a risk of giving intravitreal anti-VEGF agents. Otherwise, I do not give steroids as a primary care in a treatment name patients, because I feel that ischemia is the key factor in venous occlusion, and anti-VEGF probably helps and probably even delays or prevents or reduces the incidence of neovascular glaucoma, because in the CRUISE trial, in the long-term retained study, they have shown that basically patients who are on frequent anti-VEGF injections and in the compared to the sham group, the incidence of neovascular glaucoma was definitely less. And I do fundus fluorescein angiography in patients who require frequent injections, or in eyes with ischemic CRVO after the hemorrhages are recently absorbed, to look for significant capillary closure. This is my fourth case. This is again a 57-year-old patient diagnosed elsewhere with associated primary open-angle glaucoma. This patient had already received 12 injections of ranibizumab. In this particular patient, I put the patient after initial fundus fluorescein angiography. I did it initially itself because he has already been treated elsewhere with multiple injections. But again, I did not see much of an enclosure. I put this patient on aflibercept because I thought that he has already had ranibizumab. I put the patient on aflibercept based on the available evidence, and I could stretch him about 3 to 4 months because this patient was coming to see me from abroad, and he wanted a longer period of quiescence, and aflibercept gave me about 3.5 to 4 months, or probably 4.5 months of quiescence as far as this particular case is concerned. Therefore, aflibercept is definitely an option in patients with central retinal vein occlusion, especially in situations where there is a frequent need for intravitreal injections, and probably this may give a longer period of quiescence as far as the management is concerned. FFA in CRVO, when and why, I have already explained that basically not to do it in the initial stage. It's necessary to describe, find out the amount, if the element of ischemia in a patient with ischemic central retinal vein occlusion, and probably pan-retinal photocoagulation, especially in eyes with global ischemia, where there is a very high risk of neovascular glaucoma is indicate laser photocoagulation. I do it in all cases of significant peripheral ischemia where I feel there's a significant risk of neovascular glaucoma. I advise because these are patients who may not come for regular follow-up, and finally they may land to us with with advanced neovascular glaucoma and a blinding complication. I also do it as a first line of treatment in neovascular glaucoma. This is my 6th case, a one-eyed patient who came to us very recently during the pandemic. And this patient again was blind in one eye. In the other eye, he came to us with a central retinal vein occlusion, significant increase in macular thickness, and he had a 636 N18 vision. He improved to 620 with the injection, but then the patient reported neovascular glaucoma, which was treated with intravitreal injection, pan-retinal photocoagulation, and subsequently, since the patient had useful vision, he received an AGV implant. This is my last.
Really sorry.
And basically, hemi-CRVO basically also was treated the same way. So in summarizing, basically, I would like to say that basically in CRVO, we need to monitor disease activity with OCT and visual acuity on a regular basis. Anti-VEGF is the standard of care. Decision to treat should be based on visual acuity outcomes, and neovascular glaucoma is a potential blinding complication. Thank you all for your kind attention, and I'm sorry I crossed the time limit.
Thank you, Dr. Giri, for a wonderful lucid presentation. So we'll discuss these two presentations, and there is a question for Dr. Lalit Verma in the Q&A box from Dr. Ghosh, who has asked, in treatment of BRVO, do we need loading dose of anti-VEGF even if the macular edema subsides after one injection?
No, I don't think so, because it's not like ARMD where we loading dose or IPCV. In vascular disease, BRVO, specifically in BRVO, I am not a fan of giving loading dose. What I would do is, after, if the patient has responded, I would perform an angiography just to rule out any ischemia, significant ischemia, and keep the patient under follow-up.
Yeah, that was one thing which is common to Dr. Lalit and Dr. Giri were mentioning, is that they'll do an FFA, look for peripheral areas of capillary non-perfusion, and do laser. But then studies have shown that would this be to decrease the macular edema, or would this be for the risk of neovascular process?
So in my, as far as BRV is concerned, I think it does help not only from the point of view of neovascularization, but if you kill those ischemic areas or make hypoxia into anoxia, this does help to reduce the VEGF production, and it may put an end to injection or limit the number of injections.
But the studies have shown otherwise, isn't it, Dr. Lalit?
Yeah, but I don't know. My personal experience says, whenever I've lasered a BRVO which was having an ischemia, and so for months and months and years, they may not require injections. I don't know what Giri has in mind.
Well, I think, Mahesh, we can take it like this. See, there are certain patients with BRVO also who need very frequent injections. And in fact, I remember one of my patients who used to come to me very regularly. But so finally, a fluorescein angiogram, and he received a laser photocoagulation to the ischemic retina. And again, after that, 1 or 2 injections. But after that, he is okay for a long period of time. Now, we really do not know whether it's the natural course. But then these are patients who, over a period of 2 years, have received about 7 to 14, around 10 to 14 injections. And basically, then the question arises, they ask what else can be done? So in such a situation, I think if there is definite ischemia, I think there is no harm done. It may not, I don't say that it's going to work in every case, but there is no harm done. We are not doing any harm to these patients.
Actually, Lalit has a more simplified BRVO, but tributary BRVO also certain times it becomes so chronic, it don't respond so easily. So that message should go across to everyone that you cannot take BRVO easy. It's a chronic disease, and certain times it requires more injections as much as CRVO. And peripheral ischemia definitely to be seen. It is not like full sector or full PRP will do, but limited PRP and the peripheral area where the ischemic areas are there, that definitely helps in reduction of the macular edema. It is not only for avoiding the neovascularization, both CRVO as well as BR. So we should be very focused in identifying these areas of ischemia and then targeted laser should be done?
No, just
That
to
was
add
actually
on, just one scenario. I have both for Lalit and Dr. Giridhar. That vision, there is a patient vision maintaining somewhere between 6/9, 6/12 fluctuate. We have enough amount of laser done. We have multiple injections going on. Now he sort of stabilized every 3 months, one injection. But the moment you exit that, vision goes down from 6/9 to 6/12. You can make out very thin, flimsy membrane. There is like a ERM-like thing. There is no PVD yet. Now you are neither here nor there, and the time comes like where you would like to stop the treatment. Even if you delay, it doesn't reduce beyond 6/12. But if you give injection, it comes back to 6/9. This is going on last 2.5 years. And obviously this patient, I won't suggest, because there's a minimal traction, I won't suggest vitrectomy in this scenario. I mean, how you are going to deal with this scenario?
So I have a detective like this. He is an engineer by profession, and his right eye, you see, I have lasered sector laser only, and his vision is 6/9, 6/12 parts. But the way I follow that patient is, I have done serial OCTs every 4 to 6 weeks, and that that edema is constant. There's some edema, but it's constant, irrespective of whether I give injection or not. This cystic edema, which is slightly parafoveal, is constant. So I'm not doing anything except following him up.
Yeah, similar scenario. Or you isolated one single cyst sitting right at the fovea, nothing happens whether you inject or do not inject. 6/9
Actually, though, that single cyst will never respond.
Never, yeah.
Agree.
Will never respond. So
Yeah, that's
After
another
that,
thing we need
what
to understand.
Pramod said, if there is a epiretinal membrane,
Yeah.
especially even if it is a mild traction, it's always better to go for vitrectomy. These cases I have found that post-operatively it somehow stabilized.
But
You do not
you
go
see,
for repeated injections.
my criteria of doing a vitrectomy in a 6/9 vision is patient has to ask for it or beg for
I
it.
agree.
Obviously.
I don't. I will not. You see, these membranes
Obviously,
may look simpler.
I agree with Dr. Lalit. So I'll be
These
hesitant to
can
go
be
in.
very difficult vitrectomies, I agree.
Yeah.
And yes, what we need to understand is like BROs, like the treatment may go on for years together, 3 years, 4 years, and even subsequently, some of these patients may continuously need treatment. So in the interest of time, we'll go on to our next talk, which again is an interesting one by Dr. Avinash. He'll be speaking to us about how the vein occlusions in younger people are different and how do we go about investigating them. Dr. Avinash?
Yes, sir. Right. Thank you, sir, for giving an opportunity and inviting for your session. And we all know when are my slides seen?
Yeah.
Yes. Your 18 clinical pearls are seen.
Yeah. Let me complete before the buzzer goes. So when we all aware that when retinal vascular occlusion in young means we are looking at a profile of individuals or populations less than 40 years. And when we have this younger population, we must also know that they would present with various clinical spectrum, and the approach also has to be different than the patients who have vein occlusions when they are elderly. Most commonly caused by diabetes, hypertension, dyslipidemia, atherosclerosis. So I will take through this entire presentation with just 18 clinical pearls. And the first is what is the difference between the type of hemorrhages in retinal vascular occlusion when we compare from an elderly to an young. And we all grew up with understanding that superficial hemorrhages are the commonest clinical manifestations of what we get to see in a patient with retinal vascular occlusion. But here I would like to draw the attention that in young, there may be a higher instance of deeper intraretinal hemorrhages when what we can see on the left-hand side compared to superficial hemorrhages. And why so? So what is the cause for the deeper retinal hemorrhages compared to superficial hemorrhages? So the typical block, the hypertension associated, the age-related, there is an acute rise in back pressure that causes ruptured superficial capillaries resulting in flame-shaped hemorrhages, where that's not the case for a deeper retinal hemorrhages. The deeper retinal hemorrhages usually is caused by gradual raised pressure or for vascular endothelial injury. So this is how the difference of the deeper and the superficial hemorrhages do happen. And to add a few more points, when you see a patient who has deeper hemorrhages, suspect the underlying etiology to be systemic, and it is more profound and of chronic nature and not acute nature. So like what I mentioned earlier, the causes of vein occlusion in an elderly and young are different. But when you have the age less than 40 and we subdivide them into the pediatric age group and the 18 plus age group. So we in pediatric age group, we have the cyanotic heart disease is something which we have to keep in mind, which never strike us when we see a vein occlusion. Apart from that, we have the inflammatory etiologies, the Aplas and Behçet's, though rare, the children can present with Behçet's as well. So rarely you have an inflammatory etiology as a cause in that age group, other than or an infective etiology in that age group. But do remember, it's a cyanotic heart disease with elevated hematocrit value is something which we have to concern at the pediatric age group. Having spoken about the pediatric age group, few more diseases just gets added when a person crosses 18 plus. And there are hypercoagulable states where protein C, protein S deficiency, blood dyscrasias like leukemias, polycythemias, again, a host of inflammatory conditions. You have the primary APLA, the secondary APLA conditions, infections like tuberculosis and toxoplasmosis, and drugs like OCPs and hormones can also come into play. So, few clinical signs which I would like to highlight is, apart from the age, which is of significant concern in people who are less than 40 or even more than that as well, is the dark column of blood is always suspect in hypercoagulable state whenever you see a vascular occlusion, venous occlusion with a dark column. So check for protein C and protein S deficiency, especially if they come with the disc edema. And the next condition, like what I mentioned, is leukemias, apart from protein C and protein S deficiency. And the mechanisms by which they develop vein occlusions is because of raised blood viscosity, increase in WBC and platelets, and above all, because of optic nerve infiltration. So many a times, both the acute and the chronic types of leukemias, both of them can cause vein occlusions, more so common in the chronic ones. And how does clinically we can identify that if there is a venous occlusion is because of leukemia or not, is the presence of broad spots, dark blood columns, perivascular infiltration which does not leak on fluorescein, and the sudden appearance of NVE. So these are the last two are something which is very important. The perivascular infiltration which doesn't leak on fluorescein, and the sudden neovascular appearance is important. Now, moving on from, I just discussed about protein C and protein S deficiency, then the leukemias, the inflammatory causes. Top among the list are tuberculosis, second is toxoplasmosis, and third is the Behçet's disease, are the three most common cause of retinal vascular occlusion when we see patients with posterior uveitis. And some interesting clinical findings by which these retinal vascular occlusion manifest in presence of retinitis is, if you look at the picture on the top, on the left side on the top, the retinitis can be totally engulfed, or the vasculitis can be totally engulfed by the retinitis. And the picture in the bottom, in the middle, you will be able to see distal to the vasculitis, you will be able to see a retinitis patch, or there can be a retinitis patch proximal to the area of vasculitis. So these are the three ways by which one would be able to associate a retinitis with vasculitis. Either it can engulf it completely, or can be found distal to the occlusion, or even proximal to occlusion. So is it important that we have to do a detailed peripheral retinal evaluation in case of retinal vascular occlusion in young? Yes, sometimes these patients can also present with exudative retinal detachment, and sometimes we'll be able to pick up an AV malformations which can cause venous occlusions in these patients. And sometimes even a very careful examination of epipapillary and peripapillary loops is also important to find out an etiology for retinal vascular occlusions. So having understood the various clinical manifestations, if a patient presents with AV malformation, it is important that we have to image the brain, because some of these patients can present with similar malformations in the brain as well. Now, we spoke about vascular occlusions, but in this age group, or even in elderly age group, if a patient presents with bilateral, it's a red flag sign. And in an younger patient, always suspect leukemia. And another etiology which one would consider is Waldenstrom's macroglobulinemia. An additional point which I would like to mention here, or clinical point, is patients with Waldenstrom's macroglobulinemia rarely present with macular edema. So if a patient has a central retinal vein occlusion and does not have a macular edema, consider two differential diagnoses. It could be a cilioretinal artery occlusion, or a patient can have Waldenstrom's macroglobulinemia. So another manifestations, we consider rod spots, we considered bilaterality, we considered darker blood column. One more considerations, especially in a young, is coexisting arterial occlusion. So when a patient has a coexisting arterial occlusion, think about an etiology of either primary aplar or a secondary aplar, and rarely primary or secondary hyperhomocystinemia can also cause an associated arterial occlusion. So my 14th pearl would be in terms of if a patient presents with bilaterality or can have multiple recurrences, like one eye can have a branch retinal vein occlusion, other eye can go on for CRVO, and then can develop another vein occlusion in some other quadrant. So always suspect the underlying systemic etiology has never been diagnosed. It's something which we have to go behind it. OSA, obstructive sleep apnea, is one such etiology which we have to consider, especially when there are recurrent vascular occlusions. And what are the outcomes? The important is especially in a young, when we know what could be the cause, many of these vascular occlusions resolves when the underlying etiology has been treated. And this is one such patient who had a venous occlusion because of secondary hyperhomocystinemia. Vitamin supplementations because of the micronutrient deficiency was all what was required for the condition to resolve. And this is another patient who developed a venous occlusion because of atypical optic neuritis, and for treatment of optic neuritis itself had resolved the macular edema in this patient. Now, I did discuss about, the outcomes would be primarily influenced by the underlying etiology, and many times treating the underlying etiology itself helps in the resolution of vascular venous occlusions. Now, we know that anti-VEGF is a primary treatment in most of the cases with venous occlusions. But there is something which we have to understand, especially in young. We have to have some sort of an judicious use in young, especially when we are dealing with an aplar-like condition, where sometimes when you have a coexisting arterial occlusion, injecting anti-VEGF can worsen the venous occlusion or further enhance the arterial occlusion from happening. So that's why we have to exercise a concern, especially when you're dealing with an SLE or coming with a secondary aplar or a primary aplar. Don't go away right and injecting an anti-VEGF in these patients. And another indication where we can still inject anti-VEGF apart from CME, NVI, NVD, or NVA is a presence of exudative retinal detachment. So if a patient presents with exudative retinal detachment, that be one more indications where we can go ahead and. So I did finish my 18 clinical pearls. Just about red flag clinical signs: deeper hemorrhages, darker blood column, bilateral occlusion, rod spots, associated arterial occlusion, recurrent occlusion, and absence of macular edema are important red flag signs. And for evaluation, those who we consider the block at the AV crossing, then we know the etiologies of hypertension, hyperlipidemia, obesity. But those which are not at AV crossing have to have a detailed evaluation. So outcomes primarily depends on the etiology, treat the underlying cause, and be judicious of using anti-VEGF, especially in an younger individual who presents with vascular occlusion. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Avinash, for a wonderful lecture with a lot of learning points. We will hear Pramod also before we go on to the discussion, if the hall, the people permit has to have discussion, because it's turning out to be a wonderful webinar all said and done. Pramod, we'll go on with your discussion, with your presentation.
Can you see the screen?
Yeah, we can see the screen and we can hear you also.
Yeah, good. So good evening, and thanks Mahesh and Partha and AIOS for giving me this opportunity. So the vitrectomy for retinal vascular occlusion, they have a specific indications like non-clearing vitreous hemorrhage, fractional detachment, or combined retinal detachments. You have epiretinal membrane, vitreomacular traction, macular hole. These are typically indications for any vascular retinopathy, nothing much different except probably neovascular glaucoma. We need to look at it, and also sometimes have tractional macular hole in this group of diseases. Again, goal of the surgery is same, to clear the media opacity, relieve all the traction, and most important, what you are looking at, it reduce the ischemic drive and stabilize the eye by removing all the scaffolds, and do a laser or anterior retinal cryopexy if needed, because these are the eyes we need to go quite aggressively. Otherwise, most of, as Dr. Giridhar suggested, eventually, otherwise, sometimes they can land up in neovascular glaucoma and painful blind eye. So also, there are few reports that effect of vitrectomy, probably it helps you to increase the transport of oxygen to ischemic area and thereby help in clear the VEGF and cytokine, and probably help in some amount of reduction in a macular edema as well. So preoperative evaluation, just the standardized things, but what you need to look for a rubeosis iris is an angle neovascularization, because that is going to change your management plan and also extend configuration of detachment, vitreous attachments if you can make out, and that will help you to plan your strategy. And if you have extensive fibrovascular proliferation or rubeosis or angle neovascularization, you probably would like to give anti-VEGF before starting your surgery. Ultrasonography, as usual, useful in any media eye where you have a media opacity, to look for a location and configuration of detachment, vitreous attachments, or vitreous membranes, if any. So basic standard vitrectomy steps are same, but what we need to look at some additional steps here, probably ILM peeling will be more aggressively if you are doing, if you have macular hole or macular edema or attraction. Sometimes you need to add buccal, particularly because of your peripheral membranes are there and traction cannot be removed. And occasionally you may need retinotomy or retinectomy, and eyes with NVG, we may have to combine vitrectomy with a glaucoma drainage implants. So certain practical issues when you deal with these eyes are, you have a very, very dense vitreous hemorrhage. We'll show one of the cases like that. Prolif is extremely flat most of the time with a firm attachment, and retina is because of ischemic, as against when you see in a diabetic TRDs. So you need a very meticulous dissection and very, very high risk of iatrogenic breaks. And also sometimes, as I said, prolif is more peripheral. So hence sometimes you need to take a call whether to dissect it or leave it and maybe support with a buccal or case to case, we are going to decide that. And this is just where to start. Generally, typically you see reasonably dense vitreous hemorrhage, visibility is not compromised. You just start with the near the sclerotomy and then slowly move forward. And as you go beyond, this is another case by case we'll go through. This is a 60-year-old male, diabetic, hypertensive, superior temporal BRVO. This is one of the probably simplest cases. You have a single isolated attachment here and attachment to the disc. Complete the vitrectomy, this superior temporal branch occlusion. Technically, surgery is almost simpler, except those two attachments. Trim this prolif. Basically, hemorrhage was because of tug on this blood vessel. There's not much vascular activity. And once you trim this one, job is done and patient got back excellent vision. This is another eye having 60-year-old female, diabetic, hypertensive again, having a CME with a, obviously is a traction component, already had a laser. So again, option was obviously vitrectomy. Again, Tricart was, though after initial vitrectomy, Tricart was used to induce the PVD, and you realize there was no PVD, but lucky for me that it came out very easily. But what happened when you induce this PVD? Try to avoid inducing on the temporal side or on macular side, because there is significant tug. And when you get here, this case just started coming up on its own before I realized it was separated here on the macula also, and as well as this prolif also came up on easily. And then it become very easy to remove this off. And most of the time, as we know, that this prolif and this tractional component is due to cicatricial changes and when fibrosis starts. So, sorry. This is another case. 55-year-old female. And what you see is a like ischemic superior retina exactly along the vessel. The polyp is firmly adherent, little bit elevation. Okay. You ensure that you remove the fibrovascular polyp bridging traction from the edge of the polyp to the vitreous base. Otherwise, they don't do well generally. And then you go on peeling the membrane over the macular area. And subsequently, I could peel that from the disc. And generally, you start at the disc and go towards the periphery because this acts as a fulcrum here. And best way now to deal with these eyes, particularly when you do a membrane peeling, bimanual dissection, I think we are most of us are very, very comfortable now. And what is happening here, you see the extent of these membranes are far beyond than what actually visible membrane. So you need to keep this in mind, go beyond that, identify the edge, and then work your way forward. So once you have cleaned this area, those tentacles, then you lift over the disc. I trim this thing, and then rest of the part we showed. There was significant bleeding on this vessel because this polyp is sitting right on the vessel, and it gives way sometime. And these are major blood vessels, and it can be sometimes very troublesome. I could stop it only by having a mechanical traction, pressing the cutter there for a while, hold it, raise the bottle height, stop the vitreous surgery, and then once I could get the bleeding under control, proceed further. And this is the most difficult part, which is firmly adherent. Then you have a blood clot around it, but ensure that this traction is relieved, this bridging vitreous is removed. And like ultimately, I left small but residual membrane and this clot as much as we could, but I knew underlying retina is ischemic. And if you try to remove entire clot, I would tear the retina there. Eventually, it is going to get absorbed. So I left it at 40 like that. This is another case, having a macular hole, and because of traction, you have a localized detachment here because of that. And this is a typical, again, superiotemporal vessel, firm, flat, polyp, fibrotic. Okay, very difficult to get the edge. Here, actually, I was using this 25 gauge cautery tip to just create that vitreous schisis edge lifting up. Membrane is here, edge, the visible edge, but that other edge going beyond this. And once you get that edge, then start separating around. Partly I could get it. And then once all around those tentacles are freed, I could pull this membrane right on the disc. The difficulty here is because retina is mobile, you don't have counter traction. If you try to pull too much, I didn't want to create tear here. This part came out easily. Sounds very easy. You get excited, but then once you reach this part, end of this polyp, and this was firm attachment. And ultimately, while removing this, though I could dissect, but I created two tiny iatrogenic breaks here. This is what came up, and then I started bleeding here. Managed to control the bleeding, and eventually, ultimately, we did ILM peeling in this case. Patient did well, achieve 6/18 vision at the end, and maintaining that vision now. Yes, sometimes we need to do retinotomy because you see this flat polyp firmly adherent, and once you create one underneath, and sometimes this is a typical also you see with a retinal macroaneurysm along with that, and it becomes sometimes whole thing one single unit, and there's no way you can separate it. You have sometimes associated subretinal hemorrhage, interretinal hemorrhage, and superficial. This whole thing a single sandwich. So you just cut around and settle it down. Fortunately, it was on a nasal side, so it helped didn't compromise the final visual outcome. This is another case, and this is what I was talking about. Elderly lady, diabetic, hypertensive, dense vitreous hemorrhage. These are very typically you see in occlusion. This is what like old dense vitreous hemorrhage. More commonly, you see these and a vascular occlusion. She had a CRVO, sorry. And this is again coming out as you see, alter blood, old one, indicating view. Yes, this is the last case. I'm stopping after this. And keep on dissecting out. And what you look at is see like a murky material coming out. whole blood is stuck to the retina here. Layer by layer, you remove it. But generally, these are the eyes. Though technically surgery you can complete, you need to have a lot of patience. Peripheral blood, as you see, again, is that, but eventually final visual outcome is not really that great. So maybe there are multiple cases. I think I will stop here. This is just had a tractional macular hole. These are just Mahesh wanted to talk about our result. Just to summarize, I could pull out last 2 years, seeing some 25 patients had TRD and 16 had CRD. But what we could realize is when you look at the improvement, these are like almost 100% cases have iatrogenic break while dissecting in a CRD, and almost 70 to 75% cases in a branch vein occlusion while peeling the membrane. But eventually we could get reasonably good functional outcome, better in a tractional combined detachment than the tractional detachment. Probably tractional detachment may be longer duration. Just stop here. I just would like to acknowledge my colleagues, Sukarma and Shilpa, my fellows, and Rajiv and Chetan for sharing these results and video with me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pramod, for the wonderful videos and wonderful presentation. So this is what I want to highlight, that the vitrectomy for vein occlusions is a different ballgame as compared to a diabetic vitrectomy, because diabetic eyes do have some patches of normally functioning retina which are perfused, but in a vein occlusion, that whole area is not perfused, giving rise to increased risk of iatrogenic breaks and the hyaloid being densely adherent to the retina. So I have taken about like 10 minutes of permission from the hall coordinators for discussion. So are there any questions or any comments on the previous 2 lectures, including Avinash? I have questions for the panel, like say for instance, the patient presents with 6/6 vision, no macular edema, but a CRVO which is evolving. Would you inject in these patients in an attempt to abort the CRVO process? Dr. Giri or Dr. Lalit?
Oh, I will not do that. I mean, basically, I don't know. I don't think there is any evidence to tell us.
Mahesh, in these cases, we will not inject. Rather, what I do is investigate for the etiological factor, because that is when we need to identify the etiological factor and avoid or treat the etiological factor. Then usually it regresses. What Avinash showed in one of the cases, the hemorrhages are there and it has resolved. It is at that stage.
Would you consider systemic steroids? Any of you would consider systemic steroids at this point in time, even if it is not a young patient who is just about evolving CRVO? Would you consider systemic steroids in an attempt to abort the occlusion?
No, I don't think so. Unless there is an inflammatory component, never. Systemic steroids, no?
Yes, systemic steroids, yes.
I will not. Lalit?
No, young patients, I would, because we had done one study long time back, CRVOs less than 40 years. So 1/3 we found inflammation, 1/3 we didn't find anything. So where we didn't find anything, we did empirically try steroids and it did not work out.
Avinash, any thoughts?
No, so what I would think is when a patient has an evolving, I don't inject immediately in these patients, but
not injection, systemic. He's asking systemic steroids.
Systemic, I don't do unless it's an inflammatory etiology. So if I just follow up these patients very closely if they are 20/20, and probably on a weekly basis I follow and look out for more evolution of the evolution of the vein occlusion itself, and also follow the macular thickness very closely in these patients, including the center of the fovea and in the peri and the parafoveal area. And if there are any changes where we can see a documented increase in the thickness, we all know the earlier intervention in central retinal vein occlusion associated macular edema has the best prognosis. So that's the time when I can go for intervention.
You mentioned
Mahesh,
about 3. Yes,
Mahesh, what will you do?
Yes.
What will you do? I'm asking you.
Like Avinash said, I would usually follow the patient up every week. So at the earliest incidence of edema which is happening, I would inject, because I have had instances, younger patients, yes, I would empirically treat them with steroids also, because we have managed to abort the CRVO from progressing. So that also we have managed. But of course, it's not too much of an evidence to say that. but we assume it could be a papillophlebitis and treat them empirically if it is a younger patient. Rajiv, you want to add anything?
Oh, sir, it's fine. I was about to tell about papillophlebitis because that was a term which was used before, and that warranted the use. Like the steroid was used, but currently systemic steroids we don't give in these cases. A regular follow-up is something which we'll do.
Those are the cases, Rajiv, we used to see in 2 weeks' time it worsens like anything. So we used to give steroids in those cases. Nowadays, we are not even coining the term papillophlebitis.
Avinash, you mentioned about 3 different types of retinitis, if I remember right, or the inflammation between along the vessel or before that or like posterior to that. What is the significance?
There's no clinical significance terms in form of it's just a clinical observation where it's the retinitis sometimes can be completely engulfing the vessel or can be seen distal to the vessel or can be seen proximal to the vessel. So if you want to really dissect and see where the clinical information, if you add, suppose the other day we got to see a patient who had a younger patient who had a vascular occlusion. The fellow totally missed picking up retinitis in the periphery. So that's where when we see a sclerosed vessel, it's important that you follow it up till the end so that we don't miss an underlying cause.
Okay, and also you mentioned about the hemorrhages associated with arteriovenous crossings and not arteriovenous crossings as a distinction to say that like hypercoagulability versus the vessel wall. But in a CRVO, it starts at the disc, isn't it? So how would you make that distinction in that situation, in a CRVO?
So in CRVO, we will not be able to see the deeper intraretinal hemorrhages to start off with. It's mainly superficial hemorrhages, you're correct. But if you look into when this is what I observed actually, which is not there, which people don't talk about it. That's the reason why the initial manifestation of central retinal vein occlusion presents with superficial hemorrhages, even plenty of superficial hemorrhages, is the least reliable factor for us to make a distinction that it is going to be an ischemic component or not. So that we are already aware. We don't count on the hemorrhages alone to make it whether it's ischemic or not. But if you look into those indeterminate cases where anytime 6 or 9 months later, which transgresses to the ischemic component from non-ischemic, it goes to the ischemic component. You will see the change in the pattern of hemorrhages. They are never superficial anymore. Then you get to see intraretinal hemorrhages, round and blot hemorrhages. You get to see in these patients. That's a very good clinical sign that this patient can go in for an ischemic progression. So superficial hemorrhages, I would not say in acute setting, superficial hemorrhages would make us diagnose a CRV, but never help to find out ischemic or not. But in the chronic state, the deeper hemorrhages would help us to make towards a progression towards ischemic.
Actually, he brought out a good point that the number of hemorrhages never indicate whether it is ischemic or non-ischemic. Before, long back, we used to do the ERG, the B by A wave and their amplitude to determine ischemia. Nowadays, no one is doing actually. How many of you are still doing ERG to determine whether it is ischemic, non-ischemic, or indeterminate?
We're not
We
really
used to identify this.
I agree, because it's either way, it's a kind of blunderbuss treatment where we give anti-VEGF. So anti-VEGF is the treatment for everything. So that's the reason.
We have stopped using our brain.
Possibly, we are not probably doing a thing. ERG for all of it. Dr. Rajiv, you want to say something either?
Just 2 things I wanted to add. One is this recurrent vein occlusions. If you are getting, I think you have already covered that you should have a suspicion of inflammatory, or it may be probably a blood dyscrasias related. Waldenstrom also can present, but more classical is a disproportionate neurosensory detachment. So if you do OCT in this Waldenstrom, you'll get a huge neurosensory detachment and not much macular edema. So I think again, blood dyscrasias and uveitic type or inflammatory origin, you should think more if you are getting a recurrent vein occlusion. And nasal occlusions, again, that is something more classical in an inflammatory pathology. You don't get usually nasal occlusions in acquired cause.
Are there any other comments or discussion? I think we
One
can go
question
on.
I wanted to clarify because Avinash showed on very good slide of combined block. So what is the general approach in a patient who has a combined vascular block, arterial plus venous? Avinash?
Yeah, the first thing I like to rule out is SLE is the first disease I would like to rule out in this. So the moment I get to see a patient, and if SLE is, then I look into possibility even a little bit of hypercoagulable states and even homocystinemia is another condition which I will try to rule out in these conditions. But SLE and primary aplar top.
The present situation,
Even for
UPAR also
discussion.
should be thought about again.
Yeah, just wanted to ask one thing from panelists. In the current thing, when we know that there is increased thrombosis with COVID, in your workup, do you feel any other test should be added? Because no, it's not the young or old, because many times even old who have a known risk factor of diabetes, hypertension, hypercholesterolemia, we are seeing definitely more cases of vein occlusions now. So do you feel that routinely we don't do, but these cases, role of D-dimer, though it is at a later stage, but there are reports that even vein occlusions have increased D-dimer, and they say it is 7 times more in the tears. So I was wondering whether do you feel any of these tests will help us in some other way?
But even if you diagnose it as COVID, sorry, please go ahead.
I think they want us to stop, I guess.
Yeah, they want to go home.
No, the reason of finding, though your management will not change, but probably giving more risk of systemic thrombosis if it is related to COVID.
No, I think the management would change, Rajiv, because if the D-dimer continues to be elevated in few of those patients, though they might sometimes dip down to normal, again they can escalate. So that's an indication that they have to be on, depending on how much it is, either on enoxaparin or they have to be an oral anticoagulant at that point of time. So, yeah.
So is it making sense now that we should do routinely?
I think we should.
A D-dimer in these cases?
Yeah, because we are seeing lot of cases.
D-dimer.
Rajiv, we are seeing a lot of cases in the clinic that they are cured of COVID and they are coming, we are negative. Negative doesn't mean anything to us.
See,
I'm really sorry to interrupt with this, but we will have to wind it up.
Sure.
Because
Thank you very
again, we
much.
have to start the hall in the morning again at 8 o'clock and log in at 7. One kind request before we stop. Can we all take a screenshot and then I can send it to Priyam and then she could forward it to everybody? Will that make sense?
Certainly.
Sure.
So I would request all of you to please look into the camera and smile.
One other, Priyam.
Hello?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, please go
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you. Done. Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you, Nikhil.
Thank you so much.
Share with us also.
Yes, I will share it with Dr. Priyam.
Sir, I'll forward it to the group. I'll forward it in the group.
Sure, thank you. Thank you all for a wonderful,
Thank you, Mike.
wonderful.
Good night.
Wonderful session.
Night.
Thank you.
Night
Good night.
seeing